Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Soul Creativity. I'm glad you're joining us this evening. Please look below the video for information about how to contact me. My website's there and my email address. So I hope you'll reach out. And I want to mention that today the live stream is up. So please, if you have a question or a comment, we would like to hear from you. And if you feel drawn to do so, please like the episode and subscribe to the channel. And so I am talking with Ray Peterson today. And I'm so excited to have Ray because he is an absolute fountain of knowledge. And so I know that we're going to be really interested in what he has to say. And also, Ray, you have the distinction of being the first male guest on the show. So we're especially glad to welcome you this evening.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Naven, and also that I'm kind of used to this because I'm the only regular male in our meditation group that's been meeting for over 20 years. Not that there haven't been other people. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Sam from time to time, but I'm the only regular. Just to start off, in other conversations that Naven and I have had. I drew a medicine card, a Native American medicine card, to start us off, to get an idea about what type of energy to bring into the conversation. And it surprised me. It always surprises me, but I drew weasel, which wouldn't seem very propitious. But weasel medicine is understanding the hidden reasons behind things. And weasel would be the spy that would know what the strengths and weaknesses are of the opposition. So this has been a theme in my life ever since I've been in high school. Really fascinated with the idea of what is human nature. So I was a psychology major for a while, a philosophy major. I settled on political theory. I'm not sure that was still the good thing. Did a lot of literature, written some novels and things, but it's all about what is human nature. And it's the commonalities between men and women that are important, as well as the differences. I wouldn't want to underestimate either side of that equation. But getting into soul creativity, I think as a starting point, I would want to touch base with the idea of the divine masculine. There's some really fantastic work by a guy named Matthew Fox, who's written about, kind of the hidden spirituality of men. And there's some other sites that would share some thoughts on the divine masculine. It tends to be the yang energy, if you look at it from that point of view,
Right.
more assertive, not aggressive, but assertive, more action oriented. And then by contrast, the female energy would be more yin, more nurturing. But here's where I want to get into a little bit of the neuroscience, which I'm still fascinated with. I've been doing neurofeedback with a good friend who's a counselor for several years now. And we just had a conversation today, and he said the left brain, which is where logic comes from, analysis, language comes from the left brain, tends to deal with continuity, logic. Okay, how do we proceed in this situation? But the right brain, which we might associate more with the feminine side, the emotional side, is where innovation happens. So if you don't have the right brain activity, if you don't have the openness to emotion, to new experiences, then you can't have opportunities for creativity. So it's really the balance between the two. From what little I haven't researched this in any great detail, but people who have studied Albert Einstein's brain said it wasn't the size of the brain, it was that there were so many cross connections. His left brain and right brain worked so much in concert with each other. That's what led to the genius that of his work in physics and also his openness to spirituality.
That's really interesting, because one of the things I wanted to talk about this evening was, the divine masculine and the divine feminine, and how they have been out of balance in probably us as individuals and as well in society for so long, that it has created many of the problems that we're seeing come to the surface now, because we need to rebalance. And as you were talking, I was thinking about relationships when you were talking about human nature, and also literature. And that always makes me think of the human experience, human relationships, of course, creativity. If you think of the artist creating the literature, and that balance. And so I'd like to explore that area of balance a little bit, and how we're not necessarily talking just about men and women, though traditionally, men have um, displayed more of the male, masculine energy. And, we've used the term toxic masculinity, but I think we're seeing that, balance out as the divine feminine has been rising, and how they can support and complement one another, especially when it comes to creativity, which I then think helps change our perspectives. And that helps, create new systems, operating systems that have been out of balance. And so I thought we might go there a little bit, talking about balance, relationships, and, everything in nature, not just men and women, but, plants, everything has feminine and masculine energy. All you have to do is look at nature to see that. And so we know how, when that gets out of balance, what happens. So we can kind of apply that to ourselves as well.
There are a couple of ways to approach it. One would be just to reinforce the point you made earlier. I would argue that um, the our notion of dominion that goes back 2,500 some years, but really came in play big time with the Catholic Church and the early church, um, beginning with people like Augustine. That this concept of dominion is really, really damaging, because it causes us to place ourselves on hierarchies with each other and with the rest of the natural world. And this is not the way nature works. I mean, for human beings, it's not our competitive nature that's caused us to do so well. It's our cooperative nature. And that requires that balance. So getting a little deeper into some of the questions you posed, Naven, it's a matter of scale. And if you look at it as within a household, within a family, those relationships, if they're out of balance, obviously there are problems. You go up on a social level. I try to look at these things culturally, that there are cultures in families and in households.
Mm-hmm.
There are cultures in societies, and this resurgence of this toxic masculinity in the last 5 years or so has been really threatening. It's really dangerous. But like you said, I'm convinced that history works. Well, the term in logic is dialectically. There's a thesis that goes in one direction. There's an antithesis, and they kind of bump up against each other, and then there's a new synthesis, and it starts again. Well, what I've seen in earlier periods. Um, I've I've I taught political science for 40 years at the college level, and so I've been through several administrations and different periods of challenges. And whenever someone who's come into power, who's bringing that sort of dominion, dominance energy, it does bring a pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And the pushback comes in the form of social movements to say, no, 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 we're going to restore the balance. Uh, and that happened in a big way. as early as I think it was January of 2017 was that big women's march. So
Mm-hmm.
um, when any group is faced with a threat to whatever status they do have, they're going to push back.
Mm-hmm.
So taking that into the creative realm, um, it's wonderful to see how there's been such an outpouring of art from women in the last several years,
Mm-hmm.
just to reassert that balance. Um,
Right.
for me personally, this goes back a ways. In both my first novel and my second novel, um, I really worked hard on the female characters
Mm-hmm.
to go deeper to understand the motivations, and how responses would be to whatever was happening in the story, from female characters. And I like to think that that produced some of my best work, from having to be open, to be curious, if you will, about how somebody coming from another point of view. And in the first novel called Cowkind, more than half the characters were bovine, were cows and bulls. And there was a cow dog. So to get inside, that was the only way I could tell the story. I was too close to the story from growing up on a farm. So by
Mm-hmm.
creating these characters, it gave me some distance and some way to get into um, the way that they would understand what was going on in their world at the time.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking back, when you were mentioning how people, it's the language of maybe a protest, or people, like you were saying, no, 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 we're not going there. I think of that again as in relationship to the circumstances that are surfacing. And one of the things, as painful as it is with everything that we're seeing, these systems that I was referring to, maybe, displaying toxic masculinity, is that we see them for what they are. And if you can't, if they're buried, you can't even address it, or at least not enough people. There might be a small group, but we can see how there can be a big response, whether it is yourself as an individual when you recognize something, or in a family or an organization or a country, or, a world, whether it's climate change or anything else. Once we see it exposed, then we can decide what type of relationship we want to have with that information. Do we want to change it? Do we want to keep the status quo? How far are we willing to go? If it inconveniences us personally in some way. There's so many threads to that. And it makes me think of relationship. It makes me think of creativity. And it makes me think again of like literature and art, because there's all those threads always running through a piece of art that, a lot of times you were saying, the art that has emerged in recent years with women being given more of a voice. And the same thing goes with people who were silenced before.
Yeah.
So it keeps adding more to the relationship, more to the creativity, and more threads to that, whole process of art, however you think of it. And I was wondering if you, have thought of it all in that way. And
Well, I'm thinking about this now, just as you're making that point. How long ago did Margaret Atwood write A Handmaid's Tale? She
right.
wrote it quite a while ago, but
Mm-hmm.
because of recent circumstances, the and the and the putting this into media in a different form, in uh, it's an older story, but it's gotten new life now, and there are
Right.
all kinds of other ways. I mean, that's just the example that comes to mind first. That's gotten such acclaim
Mm-hmm.
for that, for an unfortunate reason, that we look closer to that dystopia. Um, but but this is a rallying cry. It reminds me of the work of Ursula Le Guin back in the
Right.
1960s and 1970s, writing The Left Hand of Darkness,
Mhm.
and that, that sort of message getting a resurgence. The Gate to Women's Country,
Mhm.
Sherry Tepper. These are older works, but they get new currency because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And one thing I would want to point out, I'm just remembering something that I learned a long time ago. When you've got an aggressive assertion of dominance, uh, that happens because there's an institution in decline.
Mhm.
The patriarchy is in decline. Misogyny is on the run. So it's done out of desperation that you
Mhm.
do that. So it looks ugly, and it is ugly, in the short term.
Mhm.
But this is not the end of the story, you know.
Right.
And it'll be interesting. I think about. I think the thing that stands out most in my mind is early on in 1989. This will give you some sense of that time frame of the teaching. Um, no one predicted the Berlin Wall was going to come down
Mhm.
by November of 1989. No one predicted in early 1989 that there would be a Tiananmen Square demonstration of the
Right.
size and scale that it was, and that a few years later the Soviet Union would be gone. No one predicted those things, and so lots of times it's the undercurrents that we're not paying attention to that are really the wave of the future.
Mhm.
And to connect this creativity with these social issues like climate change, um, who would have guessed that a 16 or 17-year-old like Greta Thunberg would have the type of impact that she's had in
Mhm.
the last few years? You know, until it happened, nobody would predict that.
I
So
think of right timing when you're talking about that. It's we forget that element, and sometimes just in our own transformation. And again, it's we've been taught, and it's probably a very um, masculine like energy, steamroll ahead, and you have to know that end point, and you're headed there, and you're steamrolling over everyone to get there. And the universe, or this collective energy might have something else, like you said, under the surface there going on that we're not even aware of. And when the time is right, when things come together, the universe is involved in it, it rises. And I think that's really an important point that you made. And also, right away it reminded me of the right timing.
right, and something that a friend, uh, a good friend of mine's friend, said to us about, say, the climate change issue. Nature bats last. We're not the ones that are going to decide how this thing is going to go. And despite what we do, nature has its mechanisms that its self writing mechanism, its self balancing mechanisms. We basically need to get out of the way.
Hmm.
We're blocking some of the things that could happen. There's a book called it's on my list to read next called Finding the Mother Tree.
Hmm.
And this is some of the creativity in other fields. So if we're talking about soul creativity, it's not just in the arts or literature, it's
Right.
across the board. One of the other things that I came across just recently, which makes me dismayed, but it's that a recent research article in the Journal of American Political Science Review uh, says that girls are being socialized early on to believe that there's no place for them in politics.
Wow.
Well, that's bad news.
Yeah.
But but think about it. They're being socialized in that way. So this is there's there are some people who feel threatened by the possibility. You wouldn't have this socialization in this direction if it wasn't a threat to somebody who's in a position of power. So
Right.
it won't work. It won't work. Um, it's um, it's it's sad that it's even being attempted, but that's where we are. And to
Hmm.
move into kind of the more hopeful dimensions here, it's by people stepping forward and doing the kind of the more risk taking behavior, which in the past has been associated with the divine masculine. Well, you know, we if you have a balance, that means if you're a woman, then you need to do some of those divine masculine things. And if you're a
Right.
guy, you need to do some of those divine feminine things. You need to become more nurturing. It's all
Right.
about balance.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's where we all benefit the most. And it's not that we're all going to act the exact same way if we're in balance. It's just that, we're kind of our best selves. And I think being in balance, again, we're talking like light and shadow, and it's bringing us into our spirituality as well. And always think of creativity as being our divine spark within. And again, it's not just with art. I mean, there's creativity in the home, there's creativity in how you handle relationships. Um, it's just across the board, but it depends on where you're coming from with it. And I think, to be our best selves, we're tapping into that divine or sacred creativity. And we do, before you comment again, Ray, we do have a comment, and it's from Lori, who says The Handmaid's Tale, 1985.
Okay.
So that's how long ago.
And it doesn't surprise me given what was happening then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's amazing, like you said, how that surfaces. I know when I did the women's march, I saw so many signs that said, didn't we already do this? Or we thought we already, took care of this. And it was all these, many years later, people were looking back to the 60s, 70s, 80s and thinking that we addressed. And I say that was like opening the door, but it never really went anywhere after that. It opened the door, it raised awareness. And now here it is, got swept under the rug for a while. And now all of this is coming back. But again, it's the right time. And, um, it's not just a narrative that it's maybe serving some, but I don't even think, if you're unaware, you don't know it's not serving you anymore. It's a
Exactly.
narrative
This,
that's
this is
dead.
as soul destroying for people at the top as it is for the rest of us.
Right.
It really, really is. Yeah. I mean, I'm tempted to go into some detail about something I used to teach about. I'll try it, and if it gets too deep, it takes up too much time. We'll jump onto something else. But, um, the the antebellum women's rights movement in America started because women were heavily involved in the abolition movement, heavily
Mhm.
involved. And for a woman at that time, anywhere in the United States, it was really risky. I mean, you were putting yourself out there. It's tough enough for the
Mhm.
men, but for the women it was even harder. And there was an anti-slavery convention in London, and several women from the United States went there
Mhm.
to participate in this convention. And when they got there, the men in charge said, "Oh, the women, this is too much for the women, so they should sit back in the gallery behind a screen, and not participate. They can listen in, but they shouldn't participate. It would be damaging to them somehow. They're so frail." And it made them angry, so they left and they walked around the streets of London and decided they needed to do something for themselves as well. So
Mhm.
that's what created the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848.
Mhm.
And there were men like Frederick Douglass in the abolition movement who went to the Seneca Falls Convention. They worked together on these issues. And lo and behold, what happens in the 1960s? The civil rights movement and the women's movement. So these cycles tend to work together in ways where it's, if I see something happening to my group, I know it's probably not just my group. There's other groups too. So we have to resist the efforts to divide us and instead become that more creative in keeping the movement forward together. So and that was something. There were, interestingly, also about the 1830s and 40s. In the 1960s, there weren't like hippie communes in the 1830s and 40s, but there were utopian societies who tried different family arrangements. Because the family was under threat. And for women, knowing intimately what it means for the family, they found creative ways to say, well, if with industrialization we're losing this, maybe we can have family in a different way. So it's interesting how that works in those kinds of cycles.
And I like that you said they find creative ways because, when there's, oppression of some sort, it doesn't have to be extreme all the time, but sometimes it is. And if you do go back and read history, I'm always amazed at the creativity that people use, whether it's to communicate. A lot of times it is communication because, they are being suppressed. And so I find that really interesting. Again, I think of that as a divine spark, when you tap into that and you start being able to communicate in some way when someone's trying to keep you from doing that.
I'm so glad that you brought up the divine spark again, because there were so many points what you made just a few minutes ago that I wanted to get back to this. It was in Protestantism, early Protestantism, there was the idea that you didn't have to go through the church to achieve salvation. And it was as oppressive as the Puritans could be. It was a Puritan idea that everybody has the potential, this divine spark in them. And because you had that, if it was nurtured appropriately, you could govern yourself. It was reason. But it's beyond reason. Reason would be that left brain, logical, analytical thing. But there's much more to that divine spark than just reason.
Right.
But that's what then later theorists said, oh, well, only men have this, only men have this. And Mary Wollstonecraft, back in the late 1830s, said, no, women have it too. They just haven't had the nurturing to bring it out. And then her daughter, Mary Shelley, I love this. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. It's like, okay, you create this monster, and the monster is going to come after you. And I like to think about, that the monster that Dr. Frankenstein was kind of like misogynistic and patriarchal. So the monster came after him too.
We do have another comment, Ray, from Obi-Wan Kenobi, top fan.
Okay.
It says, actually, there's no almost about it. I did have to force myself at first because it was unfamiliar to me. And I'm not sure what comment we were making at the time.
What the almost applies to?
Yeah, because by the time you type it in and submit it, but that's an interesting comment. Yeah, that's very interesting how oftentimes when I'm reading literature or going back and reading about someone in history, a woman or somebody else who's been oppressed, has a real knack for pointing out the irony of the situation, or going back to what you said earlier, if something isn't working, it's not working for everyone. Not just certain groups of people, but there's an awareness or a lack of awareness, I should say, you know, for people who think they're really benefiting from it and not seeing the bigger picture of how,
Yeah.
you know, how it affects them.
I want to try to work this in quickly. I think we're already out of time. But in our one of our last meditation meetings, I think it was Lori who said, talked about the master-slave relationship. And the interesting thing about the master-slave relationship, it's always the slave who has more development, who's smarter, because they have to be.
Mm-hmm.
The master's just lying back and living off the land, as it were. But it's
Mm-hmm.
it's the slave that becomes the more developed human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it
So
requires more creativity to, you know, sometimes survival just requires more creativity.
right.
And again, you know, there's just a lack of awareness um, by certain people that of what's really taking place or being able to see the bigger picture. Well, Ray, we we probably could go on for hours because we just scratched the surface of looking at like the divine feminine, the masculine, balance, relationships, communication, you know, creativity, art. I mean, it's just all meshed together. And then having you bring in, you know, the history part of it, and we're talking about what's happening now, you know, it shows you how relevant and how interconnected everything is. You know, you don't separate art from history, or a social movement from art, or what's, you know, happening on an individual or collective level.
One thing I always encouraged in my classes, my history classes especially, was to encourage a sense of imagination, which I
Mm-hmm.
defined as understanding the present as history. Whatever we're
Mm-hmm.
doing now or not doing now, at some point it's our history. And they say, what were they doing back then or not doing that they should have been doing? So it's good to keep that in mind. But I'd
Mm-hmm.
be happy to come back some other time if it works out.
Yeah, that would be much appreciated. And I'm sure everyone who's listening and listens after the fact um, would agree with me on that. So I want to thank you so much for joining Soul Creativity today. And we do hope you come back. Bye, everyone.
All right. Thanks so much.